The courtroom was packed for Tommy Walsh's assault trial. Frank Morrison sat in the gallery, watching his old Vietnam mate face serious charges. When the prosecutor called Frank as a character witness, the defense attorney immediately objected. This elderly man is clearly suffering from memory issues and bias toward the defendant. Frank stood slowly, leaning on his walking stick. What the lawyer didn't know was that Frank and Tommy had saved each other's lives in Long Tan, and Frank's memory of his mate's character was crystal clear. Welcome to ANZAC War Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of loyalty, justice, and the bonds forged in war, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe that some friendships are tested by fire and proven unbreakable, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the most important testimony comes not from what happened yesterday, but from what happened 50 years ago. Melbourne Magistrates Court was busier than usual on that Tuesday morning. Case after case moved through the system. Minor offenses, traffic violations, domestic disputes. But Courtroom 3 held something different. The assault charges against Tommy Walsh had drawn attention because of the severity of the allegations and the age of the defendant. Tommy Walsh, 76 years old, sat quietly at the defendant's table. His weathered hands were folded in his lap, his gray hair neatly combed, wearing the only suit he owned, the same one he'd worn to his wife's funeral 3 years earlier. The charges against him were serious: aggravated assault causing bodily harm, stemming from an incident at the Royal Oak Hotel 6 months prior. According to the prosecution, Tommy had viciously attacked a younger man during an argument about the war in Afghanistan. Security footage showed Tommy throwing the first punch, and the victim had spent 2 nights in hospital with a broken nose and concussion. The maximum penalty was 2 years imprisonment. Frank Morrison had driven 4 hours from Melbourne to be there. At 78, the journey wasn't easy, but when Tommy had called asking for help, there had been no question. They'd served together in Vietnam with 7 RAR, and some bonds couldn't be broken by time or distance. Frank sat in the public gallery, watching the proceedings with the careful attention he'd learned in the military. The prosecution case was strong: CCTV footage, medical reports, witness statements. Tommy's legal aid lawyer looked overwhelmed, shuffling through papers and making half-hearted objections. The victim took the stand first. Jake Morrison, no relation to Frank despite the shared surname, was 28 years old, an Afghanistan veteran himself who'd been drinking at the Royal Oak when the incident occurred. The old man just went mental, Jake testified. Started yelling about how we didn't know what real war was like, how Afghanistan wasn't a proper war. When I told him times had changed, he lost it completely and attacked me. The prosecutor pressed for details. Did Mr. Walsh give any indication he was about to become violent? Nah, 1 minute we were talking. Next minute his fist was in my face, completely unprovoked. Frank shifted in his seat. He knew Tommy's story, knew what had really happened that night. But as a witness, he'd have to wait for his turn to speak. The defense attorney, Sarah Chen, was young and inexperienced. This was clearly one of her first major cases, and she seemed nervous as she cross-examined the victim. Mr. Morrison, had you been drinking that evening? A few beers, nothing excessive. Do you recall what you said to Mr. Walsh immediately before the incident? Jake hesitated. I might have said something about old soldiers living in the past. Might have. Look, I'd had a few drinks. I don't remember exactly. Frank made a mental note. The victim's memory was already proving selective. The next witness was the bartender, who confirmed that both men had been drinking, but neither appeared intoxicated. The security footage was played, showing Tommy suddenly lunging at Jake after what appeared to be a brief conversation. By lunch break, the case looked hopeless. Tommy faced almost certain conviction based on the evidence presented. Frank found Tommy in the corridor during recess. His old mate looked smaller somehow, diminished by the formal proceedings and the weight of potential imprisonment. How you holding up, Tom? Tommy managed a weak smile. Been better, Frank. Thanks for coming all this way. Wouldn't be anywhere else, mate. Tommy's lawyer, Sarah Chen, approached them hesitantly. Mr. Walsh, I have to be honest. The evidence is overwhelming. I'd recommend considering a plea bargain. Frank looked at the young lawyer. What do you know about Tommy's background? Basic details. Veteran, widowed, no prior criminal record. Frank nodded slowly. That's not enough. You need to know who he really is. After lunch, the prosecution rested its case. Sarah Chen stood to call her first witness. Your Honor, I call Frank Morrison to the stand. Frank made his way slowly to the witness box, his walking stick tapping against the polished floor. He was sworn in with the calm dignity that had carried him through decades of civilian life after war. The prosecutor immediately stood. Objection, Your Honor. We question the relevance and reliability of this witness. He's clearly elderly, potentially suffering from memory issues, and obviously biased toward the defendant. Judge Patricia Williams, a woman in her 50s with 20 years of courtroom experience, looked at Frank carefully. Mr. Morrison, how long have you known the defendant? Frank's voice was clear and steady. 58 years, Your Honor. And what is the nature of your relationship? We served together in Vietnam, 1966 to 1968, 7th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. The prosecutor pressed his objection. Your Honor, this witness's advanced age makes his testimony unreliable, and his obvious personal connection to the defendant creates inherent bias. Judge Williams considered this. Mr. Morrison, the prosecution suggests your memory may not be reliable due to your age. How do you respond? Frank was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the measured precision that had once helped coordinate military operations. Your Honor, I remember the serial number of my service rifle from Vietnam, SLR 7-62-8849. I remember the coordinates where we were pinned down at Long Tan, grid reference 314-625. I remember the name of every man in my section who didn't come home. My memory of important things has never failed me. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Your Honor, Frank continued, I'm not here to excuse what Tommy did. I'm here to explain why he did it, because context matters in justice. Judge Williams nodded slowly. Please continue, Mr. Morrison. Sarah Chen, sensing an opportunity, asked her first question. Mr. Morrison, can you describe the defendant's character based on your long acquaintance? Tommy Walsh is one of the bravest men I've ever known. In Vietnam, he saved my life twice. Once at Long Tan, when I was pinned down by machine gun fire, he crawled 50 meters under enemy fire to pull me to safety. Another time, when I was wounded and unconscious, he carried me 2 kilometers to the extraction point, refused to leave me behind. Frank paused, looking directly at Tommy. But more than brave, he's loyal. He's never left a mate behind, never walked away when someone needed help. That's who Thomas Walsh is. The prosecutor stood for cross-examination. Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you and the defendant maintain a personal friendship that colors your judgment? Yes, we're friends. You don't save each other's lives and not become friends. So you admit to bias? Frank considered this carefully. I admit to knowledge. I know this man in ways that CCTV footage can't capture. But Mr. Morrison, isn't it possible that 50 years have changed your friend? That the man you knew in war is different from the man who committed assault in a pub? Frank shook his head. People don't change that much. Tommy didn't start that fight out of meanness or anger. He started it because someone said something that cut him deeply. Your Honor, the prosecutor interjected, this is speculation, not testimony. But Frank wasn't finished. May I explain what I mean, Your Honor? Judge Williams nodded. Frank turned slightly to address the entire courtroom. Tommy Walsh didn't just serve in Vietnam. He lost his best mate there. Danny Chen, 19 years old, died in Tommy's arms after stepping on a landmine. Tommy tried for 2 hours to keep him alive, talking to him, keeping him conscious until the medics arrived. But it was too late. The courtroom was completely still. Danny's last words were asking Tommy to tell his mom he wasn't scared. Tommy carried that message home, and he carried Danny's memory for 50 years. When someone in that pub said Afghanistan soldiers knew real war and Tommy's generation were just old soldiers living in the past, it wasn't an insult to Tommy. It was an insult to Danny Chen and every mate who didn't make it home. Frank looked directly at Jake Morrison, the victim, who was sitting in the gallery. Tommy didn't hit you because he was angry. He hit you because in that moment you were dismissing the sacrifice of boys who died before they could vote. The prosecutor tried to regain control. Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation, not relevant testimony. But Judge Williams held up her hand. Mr. Morrison, Are you saying the defendant was provoked? I'm saying the defendant was defending the memory of men who can't defend themselves. That's who Tommy Walsh is. He doesn't leave his mates behind, even 50 years later. Sarah Chen asked her final question. Mr. Morrison, based on your knowledge of the defendant's character, do you believe this incident reflects who Thomas Walsh truly is? Frank was quiet for a long moment. Your Honor, I've known Tommy Walsh through war and peace, through loss and grief, through the best and worst moments a man can face. What happened in that pub was wrong. Tommy knows that, I know that. But it came from a place of honor, not violence, from loyalty, not malice. That's the difference between a criminal and a soldier who made a mistake. As Frank stepped down from the witness box, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. The prosecutor's rebuttal seemed weak, the defense case suddenly had emotional weight, and Judge Williams was clearly reconsidering the nature of the offense. During the recess, Jake Morrison approached Frank in the corridor. Up close, he looked younger than his 28 years, with the same haunted look Frank had seen in many soldiers' eyes. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to say something. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan, lost mates there too. Frank studied the young man. I know you did, son. I didn't mean to disrespect anyone's service that night. I was drunk, angry about my own stuff. When he started talking about Vietnam, I said some things I shouldn't have. Frank nodded. We all say things we shouldn't sometimes. Jake hesitated. Is it true what you said? About his mate dying in his arms? Every word. Jake was quiet for a moment. I don't want him to go to prison. Can I change my statement? Frank placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. Talk to the prosecutor, son. Tell them what you just told me. The final hour of the trial was unlike anything Frank had witnessed in civilian court. Jake Morrison took the stand again, this time admitting he'd been more intoxicated than initially stated, that he'd made disparaging comments about Vietnam veterans, and that while Tommy's response was wrong, he understood why it had happened. Tommy's lawyer, energized by Frank's testimony and Jake's revelation, presented a compelling case for mitigating circumstances. The assault, while inexcusable, had been provoked by comments that dismissed the sacrifice of war dead. Judge Williams delivered her verdict with unusual emotion. Mr. Walsh, what you did was wrong, and this court cannot condone violence regardless of provocation. However, the testimony we've heard today provides crucial context about your character and motivation. She paused, looking directly at Tommy. Based on the character testimony provided by Mr. Morrison and the victim's own admission of provocative behavior, this court sentences you to 12 months community service with anger management counseling, suspended on the condition of good behavior. Tommy sagged with relief. No prison time, no criminal record that would destroy what remained of his life. As the courtroom emptied, Frank found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand, court officers, other veterans in the gallery, even some of the prosecution team. But he was focused on Tommy, who was standing alone near the defendant's table, tears in his eyes. You didn't have to do that, Frank. Yes, I did. That's what mates do. Tommy wiped his eyes. I almost lost it when that kid said we were living in the past. All I could think about was Danny and how he'd never got the chance to have a past to live in. Frank understood. He'd carried similar ghosts for 50 years. 6 months later, Frank received a letter from Sarah Chen, Tommy's lawyer. She'd taken Frank's advice about understanding her clients' backgrounds, and it had transformed her practice. She was now specializing in veteran legal issues, helping ex-servicemen navigate the civilian justice system. Jake Morrison had also stayed in touch, visiting Tommy to apologize properly and eventually volunteering with veteran support services. The incident had taught him something about the weight that older soldiers carried and the respect that was still owed to their sacrifice. Tommy completed his community service by helping at a veteran support center, sharing his story with younger ex-servicemen who were struggling with their own demons. The court-mandated anger management had helped him process decades of grief he'd never properly addressed, but the most significant change was simpler. Tommy and Frank now met every Thursday at a cafe in Melbourne, halfway between their homes. They talked about everything except Vietnam, because they no longer needed words for that part of their shared experience. The friendship that had been forged in war and tested in civilian life had proven unbreakable. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. Not because they were perfect, but because they were loyal. Frank's testimony had done more than save Tommy from prison. It had reminded everyone in that courtroom that context matters in justice, that character counts more than circumstances, and that some bonds are strong enough to last a lifetime. Judge Williams later said it was one of the most moving testimonies she'd heard in 20 years on the bench, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Frank Morrison had spoken for men who couldn't speak for themselves, and for a generation whose service was sometimes forgotten in the rush to move forward. So tell us, have you ever stood up for someone when their character was questioned? Have you witnessed the kind of loyalty that survives decades and transcends circumstances? Have you seen someone defend not just a person, but the memory of those who couldn't defend themselves? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the bonds that time couldn't break and the moments when speaking up made all the difference. Because here at ANZAC War Stories, we believe that true loyalty isn't about being blind to faults. It's about understanding the whole person, especially the parts that matter most. Subscribe to make sure these stories of enduring friendship and battlefield brotherhood continue to be told. And remember, sometimes the most important testimony isn't about what happened yesterday, but about who someone has always been, especially when it mattered most, lest we forget.